happy out on the land in the campo, with the animals and with the goats, and just like she grew up in Achuapa, those formative days out in the campo, making cheese, milk, going with our friends out to the cattle to milk cows and bring back the milk and make cuajada. And she had a calf that was given to her by the community when she was little, so she would learn how to do these things, and she named it Arnie.
I remember, I forgot that. Yes. One of the great honors in my life.
Hi, the Myers. Good evening, the Myers. Nice to have you with us.
Okay.
Hello.
There are some people I don't know. I don't know, Tom, if you want to go around the room, go around the computer, or do you think we should just carry on?
No, we could.
Bob Ames. Bob, that's good. We haven't seen, oh, his sister's Tierney. Sister Phyllis, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see
Welcome, welcome.
you. It's been a while. Been a long time, actually.
Good, good, welcome.
Well, I don't know who Carol T and Peter C are. Does everybody else know but me?
Are they from Buffalo?
Carol T, Peter C? You're on mute, guys.
I see Terry Bisson is with us, and Terry is from the
Hard for
Terry.
everyone to figure out.
Oh, John Keebert, yay.
All right, honor is satisfied. I will be truthful. And I wrote to Jenny and to Tom.
Okay, actually, I want to sit in on a meeting that's just starting now that talks about the situation in Honduras. So that's part of ROCLA. Do you remember ROCLA? Yeah, they have a meeting.
Yeah, I'm very
Committee on Latin
interested.
America.
I'm very interested in Honduras as well.
Rochester Committee on Latin America.
You're on ROCLA right now.
Yeah, so they're talking right now about Honduras, and I'd like to find out what the current situation is. So,
But who's this speaking?
John Keebert.
okay, I will turn the sound back on, and you can listen in for as long as you want.
It's on in space, friend.
Yeah.
I say I
John,
will turn the sound of the meeting back on, and you can listen in as long as you want, or I can fill you in later.
but John, we can
Yeah.
hear you. John?
I don't know where he's broadcasting from.
Hey, John Keever, can you hear us? Okay, he muted himself.
He's muted.
I'm having some real problems with my computer tonight. It's really running slow. And, the audio keeps breaking up. Is anybody else having a problem?
No.
No.
No,
I'm fine. Well
Okay,
done.
so we're back to Carol T and Peter C. Could you guys unmute yourself and introduce yourselves?
they're friends of Bob Ames, they said in the chat.
Yeah, they're in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see the chat. Good.
They're in the
fine.
chat.
Wonderful. Okay, so I had told Jenny and Tom, honestly, we're not getting a lot of people out for these meetings. So it's nothing personal if we don't have a full house. And we have a full house, so
We
take
do.
that
Oh,
back.
Grania.
And Grania.
Yeah, once
Grania.
Grania gets on, we're still all set.
I was going to say that Terry Bisson just hosted the Latin America Solidarity Committee in Buffalo, New York, just hosted Karen Spring.
Mhm.
What night was that on, Terry? Was it Monday?
Yeah, that was a week ago Monday, right? Yeah,
Okay.
and she really wowed everybody. She was on the road, but talking from a hotel where she had to keep her computer right underneath the server in the lobby. But she gave us the most in-depth report
Good.
we could have imagined.
Great.
Jenny and Tom, do you know Karen Spring?
Sure, we do.
Yeah,
Okay.
she's a great lady.
Yeah.
But could I ask, where's the Unitarian Honduras Committee located? because you said Bob Ames. I think in the chat, they mentioned Bob Ames
There's
They're at
Bob.
they're at First Unitarian Church
in Rochester.
in Rochester, yes.
Oh, I see.
Oh, I didn't know you had a committee on Honduras.
No, neither did I. Okay, Tom, we want to
Great.
put announcements or anything else?
I have no announcements tonight. Does anybody else have any announcements that would be interested to this group?
I get emails from Jose Artiga, who's with the Share El Salvador group. And they work in Honduras as well. And they support this Vamos a la Milpa project. And they're trying to raise some funds so the farmers can buy seeds and plant. And if anybody, and they have a video that talks about this. I haven't looked at it myself. If I had somebody's address, I suppose I could send it at the link on, and it could be sent out to the group if anybody would be interested.
Tom, should we put that in our newsletter, Tom?
Yeah, we could do that.
Put a link in our newsletter.
Okay.
Brenda?
Let's see, Kathy, I think I have your email, so maybe I could send it to you afterwards.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And I
Okay,
can
that would-
send it on. Thank you.
Okay, that would work. Thank you very much.
Great. And for those that don't know me, I'm Tom Ward. I'm the convener for ROCLA this year. And without any further ado, we might as well just jump right into the program that Arnie has graciously set up for us. Arnie, would you like to introduce Tom and Jenny?
I would indeed, but there is one thing, is that a delegation from ROCLA is going to meet with Representative Morelli next week, and in person at the federal building, and we're going to talk to him about Nicaragua, not Honduras, but Nicaragua, about the Renacer Act. We met with his aide. Yes, very interesting, very interesting. He voted for the Renacer Act anyway. So one of the things we are going to suggest is how many people, well, I'm going to suggest, how many people came to him and said, vote for the Renacer Act? Did any of his constituents do that? No. So I wish he paid attention to us, but he's basically a decent guy. And I think maybe we will get somewhere with him. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce, that was the announcement. I'm going to introduce Tom Loudon and Jenny Atlee. And Jenny, Tom, and I go back to the late 1980s. I figured it out, almost 45 years.
Yeah.
And in solidarity. And I will say one thing, not to embarrass Jenny, but she is the world's best interpreter. We all say translator, but technically it's an interpreter. And that's saying something, because Sally Matlin is the world's second best interpreter. But Jenny and Tom have spent a lifetime working in solidarity with people in Latin America, in Nicaragua, which is where I met them, and they haven't ever given that up. But they took on Honduras, and Tom would go back several times into Honduras right after the coup, and it was very, very dangerous, even for a gringo. And I would say, well, what do you say to people? He's going back to Honduras. Be careful. That doesn't really help him a whole lot when he's in Honduras and facing the thugs and all the other riffraff that cluster around the coup. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Tom and to Tom Loudon and Jenny Atlee, who, in case you wondered, are indeed husband and wife. Over to you guys.
Okay, thank you. And we just see Jill and Rich coming on. Hi, Jill and Rich. Good to see you down there. And just wanted to touch back into our journey with Honduras a little bit. And I think as we were preparing this talk, it actually was a really good opportunity. It's been sort of a very intense ride with Honduras. We thought we were getting into a very short-term emergency response situation, and it became a very long-term protracted crisis. So it was a good opportunity to kind of try to pull that experience together and try to share it with you. Just wanted to say in our past, our grounding and our first real formation education was in Nicaragua, and during the Contra War, looking at the impact of US policy. And during that time, the team was very aware that Honduras was really important, because that was the place where the Contra bases were located, and where they got support and logistical support, and Honduras was hosting, providing refuge and hosting, and providing the support for the war against Nicaragua. And so we had at that point identified that it was important to understand, and done some Witness for Peace sent some initial teams in to try to do some initial exploration to understand better what was happening in Honduras. But it was always it was a very superficial understanding. There was a lot more to know and understand. Over the years, we began to understand a little bit more when we worked with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. We were regional representatives. And at that time, we got to coordinate regionally with the social movement in Honduras as well, and learned quite a bit about the history of resistance in Honduras and impact of US policy there. And then today, the Friendship Office continues to accompany the Committee of the Families of the Disappeared in Honduras. These are families whose family members were disappeared in the 1980s during that whole period of counterinsurgency wars that the US was waging in the region. And that's our primary partner in Honduras. And so that's sort of the trajectory of our journey. And then we just wanted to kind of walk you through Honduras and US imperialism as we have lived it in our walk with the Honduran people. And so in June 2009, we were in Nicaragua, and we had actually worked with several organizations in the region to pull together a regional gathering. And this gathering was to look at the impact of US policy, political violence, and trauma on efforts for social change, knowing that part of the legacy of those counterinsurgency wars was the deliberate use of terror and violence to squash efforts for social change and progressive movements. So there was a desire to come together and talk about the long-term impact and how to mitigate against that, so that social change efforts could continue to be vibrant and unfold. And so in this gathering, there were people from Guatemala, from El Salvador, from Nicaragua, because all of those countries shared a similar experience with resistance movements that were fighting for a change and against US imperialism and US-backed dictators, and had an expression of revolutionary struggle in each of those countries. Honduras was not there because they had a somewhat different journey. And part of that was because of its history with the United States that was different. It was always the US military and intelligence hub for the region. And that shaped the trajectory of its social movement internally. And so it was always at a different pace, and it had a different trajectory. And many in Honduras actually ended up leaving and participating in the liberation and the revolutionary struggles of the other countries in the region, in El Salvador and in Nicaragua. So they were not present, but this gathering was happening in Nicaragua. We were all talking about this, looking back at the impact of the war and the journeys and efforts and what was necessary for recovery and to move forward. And I think it was day 2 or 3 into this, I got a message from Tom that there was an emergency. Could I give him 2 minutes? So went outside and he delivered the news that there had been a military coup in Honduras. And that people were calling, friends from the social movements were calling that they were in hiding, that people were being rounded up, people were afraid, and they needed international presence, and they needed people to come who they trusted, who they knew who they were and who they trusted, to try to discern what was happening. And so immediately we took this information into the gathering and we said, what do we do? And the consensus was, we go. People are asking for help, we go. So it was decided that Tom and one other person would immediately go to Honduras to listen and assess and bring back whatever request or information or that we needed to know. Because part of the issue at this point, all communication systems were down. There wasn't cell phone communication. You couldn't call, you couldn't communicate. So someone needed to go. And then what we were sitting with was the impact of the first military coup in the Western Hemisphere since the peace processes in Central America. And it sent shockwaves through the region. Because the immediate question was, how can this happen in this day and age? All of this work that has been done to come through those wars and to create some kind of record and accountability so that never again would these kind of military dictatorships take place and take root. And then it had just happened. And it was happening right there on Nicaragua's northern border. So it also, there was a real awareness that this set a very dangerous precedent for the region. And so it needed to be reversed immediately. It could not stand. But at this point, all we really knew was that the military had arrived at the home of the standing president at the time, Manuel Zelaya, had broken down the door, taken him out of his home to the Palmarola Air Force Base, a US Air Force Base in Honduras. And then he ended up in Costa Rica in his pajamas. And that's what happened the night of the coup. So I'm going to pass it on to Tom now, who can pick it up from the decision that he and someone else would go in.
So we tried for several days to get in, but the airport was closed, the airports were closed, and the borders were closed. But finally, after a couple of days, we did find a way to get in on a bus that got through the border. And what we found was that there were massive mobilizations in several different cities that were happening daily. And they would be tear gassed, the people would be clubbed, people would be arrested, but every day they would come out and come back and just insisting that the coup be reversed. And so it seemed like at that point there was still a possibility that the coup might be reversed since Zelaya wasn't dead, and it would be not that difficult for that to happen. But obviously the U.S. was not in favor of that outcome. There was an international solidarity movement that was very strong in condemning the coup. There were sanctions. Honduras was expelled from the OAS for a time. And so we decided, given that the situation continued to be pretty much the same for weeks, that we would try to bring international delegations. So we organized a couple of emergency delegations, which the point was to break the media blackout, because there was very little in the press anywhere internationally about what was actually happening, and also to document what was happening. And the US was working hard to make sure that the coup stuck and that it didn't get reversed. And so what we learned later was that So the coup was the 28th of June in 2009. And what we learned is that earlier in June, in the first few days of June, there had been an OAS meeting in San Pedro Sula, in a town in the north of the country. And so there was a proposal put forward to begin a process to readmit Cuba to the OAS. And Honduras voted in favor of that process. And Hillary Clinton was also there. And it was looked upon as a serious defeat for her for that proposal to have passed. And our feeling is that she never forgave Honduras for that. But and so the other thing is that, like, for instance, in the rest of the Obama administration, President Obama, once he called it a coup in Honduras, and obviously he was corrected and told, no, that's not the word we use, because he never called it a coup again. And then they also worked hard to squash the opposition to the coup at the OAS, and the State Department blocked every effort by Zelaya to return. Within a few days, he mobilized a plane, and he got on a plane and he came back. He tried to come back and land at the airport, but the army blocked all of the runways. There was a huge mobilization. I was there, and the army just blocked all the runways, and so the plane had to turn around. But at the time, there were also 2 people who were shot to death, who were there at part of the protest. So then what given the fact that that wasn't a way that would work for him to come back, Zelaya eventually, weeks later, found a way to sneak back into the country. He snuck in, and he ended up in the Brazilian embassy. And so there he was protected by international law. They couldn't come to get him, but they had troops around it, and they were gassing all of the protests that were coming. They were playing loud music. And so then eventually he decided that he would give up on trying to be reinstated, and instead he began forming a new political party. And all of the subsequent people who were elected as president, they were all supported by the US government. They were strongly supported. In fact, Zelaya, when he was elected, he was actually the choice of the US government, because the person who he was running against, he was with the Liberal Party. The person he was running against was with the National Party, Perfilio Lobo. And they suspected Lobo because he had at some point studied in Russia for a time. And so Zelaya was originally their pick, but he lost favor with the US because of very modest social changes that he was trying to bring about. And also the elite business community was not in favor of him listening to the majority of the people and trying to address their interests. And then subsequently, Pepe Lobo became the president in the first election after the coup. That was like 6 months later, he became the president. And so he, as well as the subsequent president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, both were very, very strong allies of the US, and they had significant support despite a lot of electoral fraud. They supported the US plan of Honduras being open for business. Shortly after Lobo was elected, they actually had a conference in San Pedro Sula that was called Honduras Open for Business, and where they were giving concessions for mines, dams, timber, coastlines, and other territory, and also separate parts of the country that would have their own, that were like self-rule, that were ruled by, they're called zedes, and they're ruled by, none of the laws of the country apply. And so it's sort of like is usurping the territory of Honduras. So after all of that happened, some of the human rights worker organizations that we had worked with decided that we should put together a truth commission. So I participated in that truth commission to document what had happened, to determine responsibility, and record all of the people who had been hurt, all of the people who had been killed. So we collected testimony of victims from all over the country. We had 2 offices, and we also had mobile teams that went for several months into all of the places where protests had happened and people had been injured or killed. And so the other part of the reason to document what had happened, and also to articulate the historical role of the US and US imperialism in the coup. For instance, the military base in Palmarola, which was the place where Zelaya was taken right after he was kidnapped from his house. Subsequent to the coup, they have set up more satellite bases in the country, the US. So Honduras continues to be a hub for US military and intelligence in the whole region. From the 80s on, since it was a counterinsurgency hub with the Contraware, and the ambassador at that time was Negroponte, that set up the death squads, Battalion 316, which continue to operate and continue to act and murder people very, very frequently. But so from the US position, the Honduras is key to US hegemony in the region. And essentially the Hondurans have told us, well, the US picks the president of Honduras. And so that's kind of been the situation for quite some time.
Okay. And so I think I'll pick up here. And so basically that was the situation that we had originally thought we were going to do short-term accompaniment, and then we were requested to stay and do continue and to work long-term. And this was a whole new experience in many ways for us, because we were working in a country where this model of development was being imposed and by the United States and engaged in by transnational corporations. And it was generating widespread resistance as the number of concessions that were being made to transnational corporations to have access to watersheds, to mineral bases, to forests, to coastlines were spiked dramatically. And in all of those places, the communities started to resist and say no, and push back and say it was unconstitutional, and try to block it, and try to use every means that was available to block the encroachment of those mega projects and development projects, because they felt that this was not benefiting them, that it was destroying their livelihoods and their communities. And but when that resistance was organized and they pushed back, it was repressed very heavily by state security forces that were funded by the United States. The new dynamic in Honduras is that these state security forces were also heavily infiltrated and embedded with organized crime and drug trafficking. And this was not new. This was also, our Honduran partners have walked us through how this was also the case during the 80s, but it was new to us to move in that kind of a dynamic with these kind of actors. And it brings a whole nother level of violence and lack of accountability to the actors when they're working as organized crime and drug traffickers. And then the other dynamic is that these transnational corporations, the mining companies, the hydroelectric dams, state security forces, again, linked to organized crime and drug trafficking and being funded by the United States, would provide security for the transnational corporations, which people were resisting. And all over the country in all sectors, in campesino communities, in urban areas, in indigenous communities. This was the pattern that was happening, and it just kept spreading, and the resistance built and the repression built, and it just kept getting worse and worse. I remember sitting at the table in the morning at the accompaniment house when people would gather, and people would be coming to work, and we'd be sitting around we're at the table at Kofade in the morning, just with the morning coffee, and literally the conversation would be, first order of business, who do you know who was killed last night? That's how heavy it was. And then the other thing that happened, because there was so much violence, then the answer on the part of the government was, well, we need to militarize. And that policy was also supported by the United States. Honduras needs to militarize. And hand in hand with that went a criminalization of the resistance. And so then for years, Honduras was locked in this cycle and would register as having the highest murder rate in the world, be the deadliest place for human rights defenders or environmental defenders. And yet, year after year, the State Department would certify Honduras on human rights and recommit to backing and supporting the government of Honduras and state security forces in Honduras. Despite a well-documented and thick record of the repression and the abuse. Then Berta Cáceres, who is a indigenous organizer and leader from La Esperanza department up in the mountains. She was leading a fight to protect a river, the Rio Gualcarque, from a big mega dam, a hydroelectric project, which is a part of this development scheme that is being imposed on Nicaragua to generate electricity for mining companies. So this is going to impact all these. It's a series of dams that's going to impact rivers, a network of rivers to generate electricity for mining efforts, which are going to further deteriorate communities and natural resources. So she led that struggle and came under heavy persecution, was under heavy threats. There were attempts on her life. She was in hiding for a period of time. She also was very well known internationally because of her long struggle. She had, prior to the struggle against the river, she was very outspoken about US imperialism. She led efforts to oppose the presence of US bases in Honduras. And so at well into her struggle, when she was very much at risk, she was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize for her work to protect the river. And the thought was that with this prize, it would give her more protection and it would help to provide some security for her. But very soon after she won that prize, she was murdered in Honduras. And that was sort of a tipping point for I think, international attention being focused on Honduras finally, despite everything that was happening. There was more international attention. For us in the States, what we did was we were able to introduce legislation finally into the US Congress that linked US funding for state security forces in Honduras with human rights abuses, and using Berta Cáceres as the story to make that linkage. And this was something that was very well documented, that but when you would go to Congress to try to advocate for suspending US funding for this government and for state security forces, it was considered an ask that you were not allowed to make. We would be told, well, that's just not a realistic ask, because we have to provide, we have to keep helping, either because they're too weak and these institutions are too weak and we have to make them better, or because we need to have leverage, and that's the only way we can have leverage. And sort of the sense of most of the advocacy groups in Washington, D.C., they said, well, that's not a viable ask. You can't ask them to stop supporting Honduras. You can't ask them to stop supporting state security forces. But with the murder of Berta Cáceres, we did anyway, but with the murder of Berta Cáceres, we asked it formally. It was now introduced into Congress and said, this is this is the end result. This is what US funding for these security forces looks like on the ground, and this has to stop. And that helped to raise awareness and raise pressure in Congress. So that was happening. And then shortly after that, the Southern District Court of New York began a series of investigations and prosecutions of drug networks in Honduras, and began extraditing some people and were prosecuting in the court. And that process led to the prosecution of Tony Hernandez, who is the brother of the most recent outgoing president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. He was convicted in the US court of participating in a massive state-sponsored drug trafficking operation, which was state-sponsored. So this is the government of Honduras that was moving tons of cocaine into the United States. So he's being prosecuted in the Southern District Court of New York for that. At the same time that the United States is repeatedly saying Honduras is our strongest ally in the war on drugs. And Tony was convicted on all counts, and also that court named Juan Orlando, his brother, the sitting president of Honduras, as a kingpin involved in the network. So I was in Washington when that conviction came down, and I was with Berto Oliva, who is the general coordinator of the Committee of the Families of the Disappeared in Honduras. And we were in the congressional offices. And so on the TV screens, literally the headlines that are running across the bottom of every screen in every congressional office was Tony Hernandez, brother of the president of Honduras, convicted in state-sponsored drug trafficking operations. And this is all over. This did hit the news. Most of what happens in Honduras doesn't, but this did hit the news cycle. And so our question, as it always had been, was, so how is it possible that the United States is funding this government, backing this government, when you know that this is happening? And that was Berto Oliva's question that day. And no one had an answer. The last meeting was with the Armed Services Committee in the House, and she put that question to them too. She said, now you know, we've been saying this all along, and now your court has said it, your Department of Justice has said it as well. What will it take to stop funding this? And they also did not have an answer. And she asked them, and why can you explain on this day that this conviction came down, the US Embassy is making a photo op with Juan Orlando in Honduras, saying again that he's our most important ally in the region, and issued a statement stating full support for the president of Honduras, who's been now named as a person of interest in this drug trafficking network, and eventually named as a kingpin. And there were no answers. We could never get a straight answer. At the end of that week, we were in a rare meeting with Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C., with Jose Miguel Vivanco, who has just been the head and has just left. And Berto Oliva put that question to him too. And she said, we've been saying this all along. Everybody knew it. Why all the money to this government when this is what is happening? And I will never forget that meeting. There was silence for a long time, and then he spun around in his chair and he went on a rant about Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And this was all his fault. And he said, the problem is Juan Orlando does whatever he's asked to do, and Daniel Ortega never picks up the phone. Was his answer to her question. And all I can say was it kind of sums up what happens in Washington. And in some ways, it was the most bizarre and most honest answer we got all week. That that support continued because the government of Honduras was compliant and did whatever it was asked to do. And that is the rule of play in terms of policy. And so moving forward, 2021, there were elections again in Honduras, presidential elections, and the Libre Party, which is Manuel Zelaya, the president who was ousted by the coup, that party is running as a candidate. His wife is Xiomara Castro. So she's the presidential candidate. And they knew that they had to win by a huge margin because the standing government would commit fraud. It did in the 2017 election, and it would again. And so they needed to win with enough of a margin to push through the fraud. The social movements organized to push everyone to get out the vote. And she did win by a landslide. There were some very high-level visits from the United States just prior to the election, and partners of ours on the ground think that that was those visits were the US coming to signal their support, that this time on this election, they were going to support the outcome of the election, and that even if Xiomara won, and they were starting to prepare the ground for the possibility that she would win. They immediately recognized her administration and started pushing their agenda, which is the Biden plan for Honduras, which is more private investment, corporate investment for the same development model. And the other thing that they did immediately after the election was talk about the Biden plan and also push, question her in order to make her make a statement. Their line is that she cannot have relations with China. So they would keep questioning her to get her to make a statement on that, that she would line up the way that they want to. And she was careful to try to not answer that question. But she also won that election in part because the Libre Party went into alliance with another political party. And that political party is a big spectrum of positions, and she is challenged with having to work in this alliance with a spectrum of political positions. What she did immediately after winning was she organized a consultation process across the country, sector by sector, to listen to the priorities of people from the grassroots, from social movements, and to define an agenda for governance from the bottom up. And at her inauguration in January, she laid out a plan, 22 points, plan for her governance priorities in this year ahead. And it's a bottom-up plan, and it reflects those priorities that the grassroots identified. The inauguration was, and what people described it as, was sort of a euphoric moment. It was a very healing moment. It was for many a reversal of the coup finally after 12 years. That goal of reversing the coup that was blocked for 12 years by the United States support for successive coup regimes was finally undone, and they were able to reverse it and end 12 years of suffering, which they call their long night. And people said what they said over and over again: for the first time in 12 years, we see a horizon. We see our horizon. We couldn't see anything on the horizon. There was no hope. There was no horizon. But now we have a glimpse of it. But very quickly already, one other thing about the inauguration, just in terms of the way she was messaging to the people. It was held in the National Stadium, and she commissioned artists from around the country to fill the top rim of the stadium. So when you're looking up, the whole rim was full of murals. And the murals are a history of US imperialism and grassroots resistance. And so that's what was in the circumference of the stadium when she was inaugurated. And after she delivered her 22 points of governance that had been generated with input from the grassroots and the bottom up, she walked out into the audience. The privileged seating that is traditionally given to the armed forces and the elite was given to the families of the disappeared and the indigenous communities, which was very significant for them. And she walked out, and waiting for her was the daughter of Berta Cáceres. And she was standing there with a barra de autoridad, a staff that the Lenca carry. It's a staff of authority, and that's what the leaders carry. And she gave it to Xiomara Castro as a gesture of their desire to work together for a new time. So that inauguration was a very important moment. And at the same time, very quickly, things have gotten very rocky for this new government. Even prior to the coup, prior to the inauguration, there was a soft coup attempt, and that she was able to ride out and get through. But what people talk about is that a priority for the United States was that then the extradition of Juan Orlando. So their strongest ally, who they backed at every turn, was now being requested for extradition and was taken out of his home into jail in shackles. And what people tell us and our partners say is the problem is the official structure that was in place. They've taken the top of that official structure away, but the whole network has not been dismantled, and that's all still in place. And so what's happening right now is there's a lot of killing. In every move that we have in a company there right now, and every move they make, they go to this town and there's a shootout and there's 3 dead bodies on the road. They go to the next town and there's a shootout and all these people have been killed. And it's the understood in part is what's happening is this network is redefining who's in charge and power structures, and that always generates a lot of violence and a lot of killing. And that's part of what's happening right now. The state security forces that are responsible for a huge volume of human rights abuses that are involved in organized crime and extortion rings and drug trafficking are still intact. And that's what she inherits. She inherits a country that is in deep debt. Lots of loans were made, but the projects were never executed. And then there's and then this government has to pay it back. So the government is very vulnerable. There are a lot of governance challenges. There's a lot of pressure from the United States and the Honduran elite that have their plan for how she is to govern and who she is to have international relations with. And she has this bottom-up plan informed by the grassroots and the social movements about what governance looks like from a very different paradigm. And she sits between these two. And her challenge is going to be to continue to walk with the people. And that's where our solidarity is needed to continue to try to speak to US and its policies to respect Honduran sovereignty and let her govern. So what we are continuing to hear from people is that there is a glimmer of hope. They feel like they have a horizon now, but it's very hard. Reality is already very quickly, very hard. And I just wanted to close by, there's a network in Honduras called the Convergencia. It's a network of many different sectors that come together to work for the social movements in terms of policy. And they just issued a statement at the 2-month period of Xiomara's term. And they issued a statement with reiterating their support and also their concerns. And this was one of the concerns that they outlined. They said, while we recognize the openness on the part of the government to build relationships with the international community, we are worried by the heavy presence on the part of the government of the United States, the visits of dozens of delegations led by subsecretaries of state and a wide array of departments from the US administration. We are concerned that these visits and close relations will give priority to a security policy that aims to involve the government of our country in international conflicts and revive the sad geopolitical role of Honduras as the launching pad for the United States as assigned to us in the last century. So I think that's what is their very pressing concern. They are very concerned that once again, Honduras is going to become the launching pad for US domination efforts and aggression in the region. So I think we'll end there and give room for questions and see what we'd like to talk about together.
Well, it's an excellent presentation. Thank you both. And I'm sure there's going to be some questions. Now, everybody was muted. So if you have a question, I'll try and recognize you. If you have your camera off, you can put your hand up in the Zoom thing and I'll call upon you. Jim Goodman.
How does Castro deal with the Harris Root Causes Initiative, which, as far as I can tell, is just having an investment from MasterCard and other companies like that? Does she have any comment on that?
Okay, I was a little muffled. It's comment on the
Biden administration plan for dealing with the root causes. Last summer, they unveiled, like a bunch of corporations like MasterCard were going to invest, and that's about as far, that's about as much as I've seen on it. Does she comment on that, Castro, the president?
Has she commented
Right.
on it?
Yeah, or how does she deal with it?
I think what she has commented on, she hasn't commented publicly that I directly, she has not commented on it in a confrontational way. I think the way she commented on it is by saying, this is what we're going to do. So for example, she has said, declared Honduras in her first 2 months, declared Honduras there is no more open pit mining, it's banned. So that open pit mining is part of the Biden plan. Investment in those type of activities is that plan. So she has put a ban on that type of mining. And I think the way she talks about it is to outline what she's going to do, the way her party and her government is going to govern, and that they are going to put historic memory and human rights and bottom-up processes and respect for natural resources and indigenous rights, that they are going to put those things front and center. I think from the social movements, they are very vocal about this plan, that plan is the root cause of the problem and is not a solution to the root causes. And particularly because the Biden plan talks about money that is going to be given rather than government to government, from the US government to private sector actors. And that's a big concern. Particularly, for example, in the Berta Cáceres case, her murder, which there were 7 or 8 men convicted for being the actual material authors of her murder. But in terms of the intellectual authors, which the family and her legal team and the international community insist have to be, in order for justice to happen, the intellectual authors have to be prosecuted. Who they identify is the Atala family, which would potentially be beneficiaries of the Biden plan as a private actor, where that own the whole banking, the FICOSA banking structure. So this whole plan that is saying that it will give US government funding to private actors. There's a lot of concern about that model because who holds those actors accountable?
Okay, I have a question in the chat, and then we'll ask Grania for her question. So in the chat, I want to know, how could US public learn about the new grassroots efforts as set out at the inauguration?
There's an article, I mean, her whole speech, we can send it, it's on our website, but, and we've translated it into English, so you can read the 22 points. That's sort of her governance plan. And we can send you the link for that and send you the document that has those 22 points articulated.
Grania, you want to unmute yourself? Grania, you're muted.
I got it. I'm sorry. It takes me a minute because my hand shakes so much. Yeah. Well, 2 things. One is when you say the 22 points, is that included in the Convergencia, or is that another document? Because the Convergencia is the one I'm wondering if there's a copy of that in it.
Okay, yeah, we can send both. No, the 22 points is her inaugural speech. That's what she committed to. These are the 22 points that will guide her administration and going forward, that were drawn from those consultations. And the Convergencia, the last point that I read, that concern about Honduras again being utilized for US aggression. That one is a different statement. I can send you that one too. That's another.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I just have a much more general question, and it's something along the lines of, why in hell does the US keep doing the same thing and think they're going to get a different result? And it's, I mean, it's just galling. And I'm sure this is not something you are responsible for, but do you have any insights, having been in so many of these meetings?
At some level, it works. I mean, just looking at how in the world, here you have, it is galling. I mean, you have the Department of Justice prosecuting the brother and now the president of Honduras, that State Department and Southcom have been holding close and supporting and protecting and swearing their allegiance to all along. Same with El Tigre Bonilla, the head of the police, who they supported despite the entire human rights community saying he is a pathological killer and runs death squads. Well, they just extradited him too, because New York court decided that was true too. but it worked for them. It worked for them because he would run heavy repression on the communities so that the transnational corporations could come in. At some level, it works.
And they can
Thank you.
overlook the drug trafficking and all of the other things, all of the human rights abuses, because it works for their companies.
And that's okay. I'll give someone else a chance. Thank you.
Ernie has his hand raised, and then Sister Phyllis will get to
Yeah,
you.
well, what I wanted to say, basically what was just said, that it worked for 12 years. And to say it doesn't work implies that we want to do good things for other countries, and we don't. We want to do bad things for other countries and good things for our country, and not just our country, for real, the rich people in our country. Hence
Right.
the title Imperialism in Jenny and Tom's talk. So they have a good track record. I mean, look how long it was. 1990 that Doña Violeta was elected in Nicaragua, and it was 2006 in the elections. That was 16 years in Nicaragua of right-wing, essentially U.S. rule. And so the U.S. gets what it wants, and it knows how to do it. It knows how to win elections. It knows how to stage coups. And we're very happy when they go right. When people rise up against us, they push us back, and we're back at them again the next time. Thank you.
Sister Phyllis, you want to unmute yourself and answer your question?
Yes, I just, a couple of things. One, Jenny, is I really, really appreciate this. I did have an opportunity in 2016 to go with a group that Jose Artiga was part of, and now Cheryl Salvador has really stepped forth, and they work a lot with the indigenous communities and the Lenca and so on. But it seems to me, and maybe you could just give us some thoughts on this, because the US has so many interests in Honduras, and my understanding was, and you had mentioned it earlier, is the location of these military bases is so important to the US, and supposedly that was what I had heard, that it was to keep an eye on this drug trafficking and so on coming up from from the south to the north. But I'm hearing a different story from you a little bit.
Yeah, they may be keeping an eye on it, but there's no way they knew all their radar. They know exactly that this was the absurdity of being in the Armed Services Committee meeting and saying they couldn't say we didn't know. They knew the whole time. So this whole drug war on drugs, and they're moving pallets of cocaine are moving into the United States from our primary ally in the region, self-declared by the US Embassy on the war on drugs, and to the point where these pallets were stamped with his initials, TH, Tony Hernandez. He was not concerned about, being inconspicuous. And the US government knew the entire time. So what are they for? What is all that military infrastructure there for?
And I think also to keep an eye on the other countries, right? Yeah. So I don't know, but it suggests that keeping the drug trafficking going is in US interest.
Right.
Very definitely, doesn't it?
Yes, Gail Mack.
Thank you. Jenny and Tom, it's so good to have you with us. Thanks so much for all your information. And I wonder if you know anything more about the mining companies that seem to be linked so closely, the US and Canada, and the impunity with which they destroy indigenous people's cemeteries, for instance.
Yeah.
Their whole land, but cemeteries seem to be something they would avoid.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of strategically why Honduras is of such interest to the United States. And I think just going back to that whole question of, so what is all this military infrastructure about? It's also about access to resources. And right now, I mean, Sophia Clark, I think Jill's sister, said it really well. It's really important to understand that right now, the US is seeing Central America as another Cold War, and it wants to control the territory and keep China and Russia out. And it wants to control those resources. And it's going to use its military structure in Honduras and in Colombia to try to do that. And in terms of mining, the mining model that was opened in Honduras with the coup was just open concessions. It's the concessions are just given to the mining companies in violation of consultation processes that are required with prior and informed consent from indigenous communities and other communities, in violation of communities that declare themselves mining-free zones. They were just blanket given this huge number of concessions, and with no environmental standards, and this is what's generated huge amounts of resistance and violence. The case you mentioned is a Canadian mining company that is digging up an indigenous burial ground and dumping their bodies elsewhere. And we hit it with our accompaniment team. Actually, we ran into the mining situation with, there was a community called La Esperanza that had requested accompaniment, that a mining company was coming into their territory. And it started to stake off land, and it started to bulldoze, and this is all without any kind of consultation, without any kind of process. And it's very reckless and very crude, the way the mining companies come in, open pit, no safety mechanisms or protection for the watershed. And so this community asked us very early on to accompany them. We had two accompaniers from Europe, a Swiss and a French woman and a Swiss man. They arrived in the company, in the community. We had been accompanying them for a while, but they arrived in the community in the morning. They stayed with families in the morning. Armed guards from the mining company surrounded the house where they were staying, fired shots into the air, kidnapped our two accompaniers, put them on the back at gunpoint, put them on the back of a truck, and started driving away with them. And on the way, they were taking them way out into a remote area. They threatened to kill them. They told them that they were going to kill them. We were able to, by an amazing set of circumstances, intercept that and get them to drop them. That's a story for another day. But we were able to get them intercepted at a very high level, and they dropped those people. What we now find, so there was a big process where we were trying to understand who was behind this mine, who were the actors behind the mine. And as with many of them, the front is that this is a Honduran company, and there was a family name the company was registered in their name. What we have now found out is that behind that was one of the biggest US steel companies in the United States, based out of North Carolina, Nucor. And that was the company that was behind the security guards that kidnapped our accompaniers. And so they're often masked by a shell company, but behind it is a US company or a Canadian company. And what the Hondurans said was, you have to go public with this case. If they will do that to an international human rights observer, think what they'll do to us. And because we have no power to speak out, no power to bring attention to this. And but it was so well hidden, that level of involvement on the part of a US company, that it took years for that to surface.
Wow. Other
Oh.
questions? Thoughts? Ernie? Then unmute yourself.
I would like Jenny and Tom to tell us in a brief word or two what you can do. I always like to end a talk with, what can you do? Now, none of us, well, I don't know, but I'm not prepared to be an accompanier, and I don't know who else would be, and that would be great. But short of being an accompanier and short of going to Honduras, what can we do from here? Is there an organization that ROCLA could contact, for example, that's working on this issue?
Well, I would say that, like, for instance, you're meeting with your congressperson soon, and I know that meeting's about Nicaragua, but perhaps to request another meeting and ask that they back off of the Honduran government, that they let the president move forward with the program that she wants to move forward with, and that they pass the legislation that's pending relative to the funding of the security forces.
Jill and
think-
Rich?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. You have to unmute yourself again.
okay, thank you. Great presentation, John, Tom and Jenny. But what about that? Wasn't there an SOA watch group that went down with some members of Congress to visit all the Northern Triangle countries?
Mhm.
Is anything coming of that? And can we do anything to help amplify that?
Yeah, we just, they just got back. It was SOA Watch and Witness for Peace. And it was there were 4 members, Ilhan Omar, and 3 others went. They are going to come back with a series of requests, one of which is to pass the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, which will suspend funding to state security forces, some debt relief, and a couple of other requests that they're asking for that came out of their experience in the region. Right now, they are going to first have a meeting with Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, and with Representative Meeks as the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And they want to have a meeting with them and share what they learned and what they saw and what their requests are going to be. So they're going to have that, and then they're going to go public with it. So there should be, once they've met internally, there will be probably some press statements and some op-eds and some advocacy opportunities to back up their demands coming out pretty shortly. So that will be coming. And I think the other thing to do is, I mean, when Arnie asked us to do this talk, my first title was Nicaragua and Honduras and US Imperialism. And Arnie had to remind me, this one's on Honduras. And I said, okay, it's hard for me to, the two are, they speak to each other and they inform each other, because even in your meeting with Nicaragua, when I talk about Honduras, I talk about the reason Honduras is the way it is because, and people, the Hondurans will say, we are not a sovereign country. We don't get to make our own decisions. And it's really important to respect that sovereignty. And I think Honduras is such a cautionary tale for Nicaragua, that if the United States continues to pursue these policies of regime change and aggression and sanctioning, if they succeed, what they want to do is to create a situation that looks like Honduras. And so just that principle of sovereignty and non-intervention, just don't intervene, listen to the people, deal with our own issues here in the United States, and let the people of Central America sort out their own realities and find their own ways. That just underscoring those principles of non-intervention are really important.
Jenny, you mentioned a website. You want to share that website with us?
Yeah, I was just talking about the Friendship Office website where
Oh,
we
okay.
posted the article on Xiomara's speech, her 22 points of governance, what
Yeah.
she wants to support. And I'll send that to Arnie with the 2 documents that you wanted.
Okay,
Yeah.
so.
And I think the other thing that's so outstanding, I mean, this, I think these spaces are really important for us to talk together and flesh things out, because just the story of Honduras and how it is in conversation with Nicaragua's story. In Honduras, the whole argument was, well, Manuel Zelaya wants to run for a second term, and so we have to, it's not democratic, and so he has to go. And that justified a coup, which the US said was justified and in the interest of democracy. And then yet it's trying to create a coup in Nicaragua to unstabilize a very stable government, the government that's the most stable, the most functional in the region. And to really question that language that gets so twisted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah, I'm sorry to keep asking. It does seem that the US public only pays attention to Central America because they don't want people from Central America coming into the United States. So the evidence seems to have been that although the US, although the policies for this coup government were beneficial to business, they were terrible for driving refugees. And, the case study of Nicaragua, which doesn't drive refugees in the same way to the United States, the way Honduras does. So isn't that a argument that we should let a grassroots effort try, because we're tired of 12 years or 11 years of failure that was driving people out of the country? Is that a good case to make?
If I might, Terry, that's actually one of the cases we're going to be making to our congressman next week. So yeah, it's kind of a telltale sign, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. The thing is that the situation in Honduras, the human rights situation, was so dire, with the police and cooperating and working together with the gangs and the army reinforcing it, so that everyone had to pay protection money. If you had any kind of little business, you had to pay on a weekly basis. Anyone that refused to pay or got back behind in their payments was threatened with being killed, and a lot of people were killed because of that. So just the whole situation of complete insecurity was a huge driving factor for the refugees coming. And that was also promoted by the funding of the US that continued to grow every year. And so essentially they were funding people to do those things. So yes, that's definitely something that needs to be pointed out.
But the other complicated piece is in all those years when caravans of people were coming, hundreds of thousands were crossing on foot, walking. They have never been called refugees. They've always been called migrants. They've not been called refugees, because to call them refugees would be to acknowledge that they were fleeing repression. And so the US has never, there was a whole effort to get them declared refugees by the UN and by the United States, and that status was never given. And so that's a whole nother piece of it. And now in Nicaragua, what we're seeing is there wasn't a flow of refugees or migrants. And now some people are leaving and the US is saying, oh, there's a refugee flow. So those terms are always being manipulated and twisted depending on the convenience for US policy. And so it takes some looking at what the words are and what's happening in each case. And I think that the biggest argument is just all this money and all this policy and the war on drugs, and the US just extradited their strongest ally in the war on drugs for drug trafficking. And please explain, why do we keep doing this?
I think everybody can see in the chat box the comment about, I think the US government has gotten wise to the fact that we keep pointing out that people are not migrating from Nicaragua like they are from the Northern Triangle countries, and now they are trying to entice Nicaraguans to migrate with heavy advertising and special treatment when they get to the US.
Yes.
So we've got a lot of work cut out for us, folks. And, you know, ROCLA's been here. Next year will be 50 years. A year from now, we'll be here for 50 years. And you'd like to think a lot has changed in that time. A lot of things have changed, but not all of them have been to the better. And we're still fighting the good fight. So Jenny and Tom, thank you so much for everything you do. There's some comments in the chat box from others that I'll echo, that it was a great presentation and well organized. And obviously you have a depth of knowledge there that we really appreciate you sharing with us tonight. And we hope to get to see you at future things. And if anything comes up that you think ROCLA can help you with, you know how to get in touch with Ernie, I'm sure. So you get to Ernie, and Ernie will definitely get to us. I know that. Okay. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And we haven't got our May meeting set up yet, but we'll be getting the word out shortly as to what we'll be discussing in May. So thank you all very much for coming. Jenny and Tom, thank you very much. Hope you have a good evening and keep on keeping on.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
staying with it.
Bye. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jenny and Tom, for your good work.
Thank you.
Presentation.
Bye. Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Hey, Tom and Jenny, before you go, oh, I lost you. Okay. Oh, Tom, you're still there. Did you happen to meet Graham Russell while you were down there and during the coup?
Graham, we knew before that.
Yeah.
When we lived in DC, he used to be based in DC. We knew him from then. But I don't remember seeing him during the coup at all.
Yeah, he was down there quite a bit. He was reporting, you know, from the street every day. And of course, Karen Spring was there too.
Right.
And I think Karen at that time was working for Rights Action. But Karen's still there. And of course, her husband was a political prisoner for quite some time. And but yeah, she's terrific.
Yeah.
So
all right.
Graham's going to be calling me tomorrow. That's why I was wondering if you knew him.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
well, good to have met you virtually.
nice to meet you. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Good night. Hi, Gail. How are you?
You're talking tomorrow to Graham?
Yeah, he texted me today and said he has some ideas. They need some money for some projects in Rio Negro. So I told him, give me a call tomorrow. We can kick it around.
Good. Well, you know, I sent you the copy of what I sent to the mining company.
Yes, it was good.
Do you know that I got a response? I sent to everything I could find, and most of them I couldn't. They said it's not a working number.